All right, hello there, everyone, and a warm welcome to everyone who's joining the Zoom grid here. I can see audience members working their way in, continuing to work their way in. I'll just give it a few more seconds before everyone gets here. In fact, we can introduce ourselves right now, I think. Welcome to this election event as South Korea votes for its next president. This is June 3rd, 2025. I'm Hans Schadl. I teach in the political science department at Yonsei. I'm very, very happy to have with me two of my Yonsei colleagues, Professor In-Bok Ri and Professor Jong-hyun Kim, as well as Professor So-hyun Park from Lafayette College in Pennsylvania joining us as well. So, all three of my colleagues, as you'll see, have studied Korea for a long time and have a lot of insight on different aspects of Korean politics and its relevance in the world. And for sure, this presidential election has attracted a tremendous amount of interest. We weren't even expecting, to be here. A year ago at this time, we thought the next election for the president of South Korea would be 5 years going forward from the last one. We would have been in 2027, since former President Yoon Suk Yeol was elected in 2022. But of course, President Yoon's martial law declaration, his attempt at military rule at the end of 2024 threw the country into a crisis that ended up in his impeachment and then his removal from power in April. And then that led to the snap presidential election that's taking place at this hour. So, it appears anyway that Lee Jae-myung, if you haven't heard of him, he had been the leader of the Democratic Party at the time of the martial law bid. He's been in the National Assembly for a couple of years. Before that, he had a prominent role as the governor of one of the main provinces in Korea outside of Seoul. He was the Democratic Party's presidential candidate in 2022 against former President Yoon, and he almost won that election. That election was decided with less than 1% of the vote. But it seems tonight, Lee Jae-myung is, by contrast, going to cruise to a win based on the exit polling. Right now, the exit polls are suggesting that he's got just over half the total vote. And the candidate who's closest to him, Kim Moon-soo from former President Yoon's former People Power Party, he's got possibly in the neighborhood of 38 to 40% based on the exit polls. My colleagues might have more recent data than what I've seen. So what we're going to do here is let each panelist, let In-bok and Jong-hyun and So-hyun go each for about 5 minutes or so to give their take on what's happening at this hour, and also to situate this election in the larger context of what it means for South Korean democracy at a time when democracy worldwide is, of course, going through a turbulent period and is in some difficulty globally. So we'll talk both about what's happening here in Korea and how it's relevant beyond the Korean Peninsula. And the chat function, well, the chat function will actually allow you to talk to each other, just to be clear from what I've been told by ISA. You can ask questions using the Q&A function. You can go ahead and do that pretty much any time during the hour that we're together. But about 11:15, 11:20 or so in Seoul, and about 10:15 or 10:20 Eastern in the US, that's when we'll shift over to Q&A, and we'll take as many of those as we can in the time that we have. Just a couple of other housekeeping things before I go to the colleagues here. I also want to thank Professor Woo Byung-won from Yonsei, who's with us on the grid here. He's not on the panel, but he was instrumental in helping us set up this event along with ISA. Big thank you to Kat Folker and her colleagues at ISA for all the logistical work putting this together. At Yonsei, the Institute for East-West Studies, and also our political science department's BK21 research program have co-sponsored this. So anyway, very pleased it all came together, and so happy that you're all with us as well. So let's go over to my colleagues. I'll start with Professor Jong-hyun Kim. Jong-hyun, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me here. It's an honor to be a panelist. So as Hans described very well, this snap election was crucial in so many ways. It's so whoever the winner becomes, he will be responsible for recovering all the political and economic turmoil this country has experienced after the failed martial law decree in late December. And because of this reason, because of significance, I thought for this election, both the process and the outcome must reflect Korean citizens' desire to maintain and strengthen democratic norms. So we all know that although legislators ultimately blocked President's martial law declaration and also proceeded with impeachment, this was ultimately driven by citizens who took to the streets and pressured their, leaders, their politicians to act and restore and to become resilient in preserving our democracy. So that said, I am personally very disappointed with the campaign process in this election because I believe the election could have and should have served as a focal point for politicians to engage in a more productive conversation and productive discussion, and also not just from one side, but politicians from across the aisle to deliberate on ways to restore democratic norms and reestablish some fundamental democratic, principles like separation of powers. But instead, we have witnessed that candidates once again are engaged in very intense negative, campaigning and attacks against each other, as evidenced by, televised debates in a few recent weeks. And as a result of all that, instead of this healing all the wounds that we experienced in the past 6 months, this election, at least its campaign part, I believe it contributed to kind of amplifying all the political divisions and polarization that we have been experiencing, and especially affected polarization among our citizens. So I'm personally very disappointed with the process. I don't know how the winner will, what kind of actions that he will take to recover the political turmoil and the true democratic crisis that this country has experienced. I'll leave the floor to other panelists.
All right, thank you so much, Jung-Hyun. Let's go to Professor In-Beok Rhee.
Okay, thank you for putting together this session again, and everyone who's worked hard to make this happen tonight on a short notice. I'm very excited about the talking about Korean elections here with the people at the ISA. I've just returned about like 25 minutes ago, maybe, from sort of participating as a sort of external observer at during the vote counting process, what we call 개표 현장. And the scene was remarkably very vibrant, reflecting, I think, high levels of civic engagement and sort of like democratic energy. So I'm kind of pumped, as you can see. Um, the exit polls that we saw right after the election finished seem to have indicated something that looks like a decisive result, approximately something about like 51 to 39 between the Liberal Party candidate versus the Conservative Party candidate. So, of course, there can be a little bit of differences between the exit poll results and the actual vote counts. At least so far as things are headed, it seems like there's probably going to be a very clear mandate for the incoming leadership that hopefully we can talk a little bit more about later. But still, the vote counts are only about 20% in. Last I checked, about like 20 minutes ago. So we'll have to see probably till like sometime in the middle of the night, 2 a.m., 3 a.m. Korea time, to see eventually how things are counted. But to think about the overall reflection about the elections this time around, even just a year ago, I couldn't really have imagined witnessing anything like a declaration of martial law in South Korea in year 2025. Seeing the military forces move onto the parliamentary grounds, I felt like this was something impossible for us to see in a democracy that we thought was very stable and consolidated. And considering that, I think there is some lessons that we have learned in South Korea, as well as hopefully that we can also think together in the context of sort of the global changes or trends in democracy. I think one very important thing that we saw, as Chang-Hyun also highlighted, is I think the importance of civil society and democratic resilience. So although civil society responded sort of a little bit slower maybe than some people might have hoped, or the institutional process itself going through the constitutional court and everything, maybe a bit slower than again like compared to what some people might have hoped. At the end of the day, still, it was the sustained civic mobilization that eventually led to the impeachment and sort of reaffirming the importance of the active and engaged citizenry and the safeguarding democracy. So I think that really highlights some hopes for us. But of course, at the same time, we've seen the ongoing vulnerabilities and blind spots in countries like consolidated democracies, even like in Korea. Just as I was leaving the venue for the vote counts, I encountered some far-right groups and YouTubers making loud noises about unconfirmed, unfounded claims potentially about election fraud, illustrating how like misinformation and conspiracy narratives are remaining to be active threats to the health of and vibrant health of our democracy. And I think that points towards the importance of not just the election results. Of course, the process that took us all the way to here is very important, but how we're going to manage the aftermath after the election results are announced. So there's still going to be mistrust. There's still going to be seeds of polarization. There's still already one of the presidential candidates um, raised some concerns about potential election fraud. So these are the things that we'll have to deal with. And in that process, how we can further rebuild, using this as an opportunity, our democracy to be even healthier, I think is going to be an important question that we'll have to ask ourselves. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Inbok. And indeed, as I've been listening to both of you, Inbok and Jonghyun, I've been also thinking and kind of asking myself over the last few days. I mean, this election certainly could be seen as, I suppose, closing a chapter that was opened on the 3rd of December when former President Yoon declared martial law. It's remarkable, actually, that the election's taking place exactly 6 months to that very day. And yet there's the other question, is Korean democracy out of the woods, so to speak? And some of the issues that the two of you are mentioning with regard to the campaign and also with regard to the political society suggest that maybe no democracy is ever out of the woods permanently, and the constant vigilance and concern is important. Let's go to Professor Soyeon Park. I think this is a perfect time to bring you in, Soyeon, with a global perspective on everything.
Thank you, Hans, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. So my name is Soyeon Park. I'm a professor of government at Lafayette College in Easton, Pennsylvania. And so I have the best time slot, I think, compared to my panelists. And so I thank you for making that possible. I wanted to take us back to December 3rd of last year. And so this is exactly 6 months ago. And I remember that day vividly. I was getting ready for class right around this time, I believe, and I was headed out the door and a student ran up to me, Professor Park, did you read the news? Did you hear about the martial law? And I thought maybe, the student was serious, but not, he was also known to have a sense of humor. So I wasn't sure if he was trying to surprise me or if it was real news. And so I didn't have time to process it quite then. And I, promised to speak with him later. But in those 6 months, I think it's important to keep in mind that things could have gone very differently, and all the things that happened to bring us here to have an election, right? A snap election today. And I wanted to focus on that because I agree. We saw a lot of negative campaigning. We saw a lot of finger pointing and a lot of lack of policy debate. But at the same time, if you look at all the checks and balances, that did work. Maybe not right away, or maybe not in the way that we had hoped to a higher standard. But I'm thinking of all the impeachment. I mean, even the processing of the impeachment process, right? It didn't happen right away, and there was a second attempt, and then finally it passed in the National Assembly. The three major presses, and all the conservative and liberal media outlets, they were united in condemning martial law, right? So the Free Press was working at least in that element. The Constitutional Court, despite a lot of political pressures, took its time deliberating and then finally rendered a verdict, which was also accepted, I want to emphasize, right away, even by the People Power Party, President Yoon's own party. And so all of these things make me think that yes, the martial law declaration was shocking, as Imbok said. Yet at the same time, the 6 months after that, we saw a lot of instances where civil society, but also political leaders, right, including President Yoon's own party, right, that they stepped in and the checks and balances seem to have worked. And so I think all of those things give me a little bit more optimism, especially if we put it in the broader context of, Poland just had an election where it seemed like initially the anti-far right party was declared the winner, but then the points, the percentages got reversed. And so we're seeing a lot of, in fact, in the past month or so, we've seen a lot of elections in Canada and Australia, recently in Romania, where it wasn't at all clear what the results would look like with the rise of a lot of extremist parties and far-right rhetoric. And around the world, it seemed like, and some have described it as an anti-Trump bump, almost like a reaction against, right? We don't want our version of President Trump in our own country. And I don't know if that's the exact same parallel in South Korea. But again, I think all the processes, as flawed as they were, and as perhaps distasteful, right? Some elements of it, of the negative campaigning in particular, I think that they ultimately persevered speaks quite a bit to democratic resilience in South Korea, especially from a comparative perspective. So this is, an outsider looking in, but to me, compared to some of the other elections we've seen, the South Korean election seems to have at least emerged from a, more or less a process where things could have gone wrong very badly. And I'm also thinking of the number of instances where there was a political vacuum, right? We had the acting president or the prime minister act as the acting president, and then he himself was impeached and then brought back. And so, we had a lot of leadership succession and turnover as acting presidents, kept changing. And throughout all that, I think democratic resilience, right, ended up being the final outcome. So that was something that I was really, really, happy to see. Somebody mentioned before also the closeness of votes in recent years, that every single president in the past 2 or 3 elections, right, none of them really had garnered votes above 50%. I think Park Geun-hye was the last president to have gotten more than 50%. And so, this is, I think, really important, given that we're not only seeing inter-party competition, but we've seen in the past, I would say 2 decades or so in South Korea and elsewhere, a lot of intra-party fragmentation, right? So you see a lot of extremist or fringe voices or factions breaking off from traditional liberal and conservative parties. And that's what's led to, I think, a rise of populist or populist-leaning parties around the world. And so I think it's really important that whoever wins, and it looks like it will be Lee Jae-myung, that they have, or they feel like they have a little bit of a mandate and that they have some legitimacy going in, because it's going to be a very short runway, right? As we know, there was no time to come up with a presidential preparation or preparatory committee. And so they're going to have to hit the ground running. And both candidates, Kim and Lee, have indicated that they will put together something akin to that, like some kind of a national committee for policy work. And yet, it's not the same as an entire, right, 3 or 4 months of preparatory work. And so I think it's really important that whoever gets elected has a little bit of that legitimacy, or I would say a slightly longer honeymoon period, right, from the publics, where they are given that time and grace to work out, right, various policy solutions and ideas. And so hopefully it'll give them more maneuverability and less attacks from within their parties and also from opposition parties. And then finally, on foreign policy, there's actually been a lot more consensus, I would say, in this election, partly by virtue of the fact that there wasn't a ton of foreign policy debate to begin with. But compared to the past, when, we used to have, are we pro-US, anti-US? Are we pro-alliance, anti-alliance? What will be our policy on North Korea? While there are divisions, of course, among the different parties and the different candidates, it seems like there's, broadly a consensus on peace on the Korean Peninsula. Nuclear weapons has been one issue where there's been some disagreement. I'm happy to talk about that later if there's interest. But again, I think the focus right now from both parties is economic recovery, how to negotiate or renegotiate tariffs with the Trump administration, And then the possibility of defense funding negotiations, right? Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth was in Singapore just this past weekend at the Shangri-La Dialogue, where he suggested that other allies, meaning in Europe and elsewhere, have bumped up their defense spending up to 5% of their GDPs. And it was kind of like this moment where, hint, hint, Japan, South Korea, we're looking at you, right? And so that might be something on the horizon for the new president to deal with. But beyond some of those specific issues, on nuclear weapons, for example, and North Korea policy, I would say there's more of a consensus this time around than prior liberal versus conservative divides. And so let me stop there, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks so much, Soyeon. You covered so many helpful angles there. And yes, on the foreign policy side, especially Lee Jae-myung has, I think, really been trying to assure voters skeptical that, voters who last time around when he narrowly lost in 2022, that might have seen him as not close enough to the idea of strengthening an alliance with the U.S. or sustaining even the alliance with the U.S., somebody who could be seen as a candidate more friendly to North Korea, more friendly to China, with some voters, moderate or swing voters, worried about that. This time, Lee Jae-myung really went on of his way, I think, to try to reassure the whole country that he was very tightly going to be in lockstep and also working, I think he used the word future-oriented with the U.S., implying that he would be working very hard to negotiate Korea's interests in a potentially changing alliance with the U.S. And yet he also tried to have it all ways. He maintained anyway, or argued that he would work to maintain good ties with China and North Korea and work with Russia. He even tried to, I think, sound a cautious note with regard to whether he would have a summit with North Korea anytime soon, suggesting that with North Korea beating Russia in its war on Ukraine, that kind of move might not be possible anytime soon. Not to mention the downward slide in relations between South Korea and North Korea over the past several years. And yes, I think on the governance question, it's also very, very important what Soyeon was saying, because in some ways on domestic policy issues, the Democratic Party, again, representing Lee Jae-myung, and the Conservative Party, which is called the People Power Party here, that's President Yoon's party again. In some ways, policy-wise, those two parties are not all that far apart. Both parties, for instance, want to have a shorter work week. It's really just working out the details, whether it's a 4-day week or a 4.5-day week. Both parties are arguing that it's time for more affordable housing, time to get inflation under control, help small businesses, spur innovation. I think there's a fair amount of consensus with the two parties on the policy goals, but it's often very difficult, it seems, for either party when they're in power to produce those kinds of goods. I mean, let's also remember there was an impeachment here in 2016, 2017 against former President Park Geun-hye. And that election as well, Moon Jae-in from the Democratic Party it was a strong victory. It wasn't 50% of the vote. I think it was more like 41% of the vote. But that election, there were 3 strong candidates. So nobody was going to get more than 50% likely. And yet Moon couldn't fully deliver those sorts of goods. Maybe the COVID pandemic didn't help. So the country went back to the conservatives, back to the PPP. It's the new form at that time of the Conservative Party. And then President Yoon came in and gave the country martial law, and that had to be overturned. I mean, it's so true that, for those first few hours, things could have gone any number of directions. And we were very lucky that the stars came together that spared the country of martial law more than a couple of hours for the assembly to put a stop for that and the country to keep going. But now going forward, can the DP, even with the majority in the parliament and the presidency back, can the DP deliver those kinds of goods? So that's one question that we can think about in the discussion. Let me also bring up a question from the audience. We're really happy to have questions from the audience now. Let me take the first one that came in and throw it to whomever on the panel would like to take it. The question is this: assuming Lee Jae-myung solidifies control after the snap election, how do you anticipate his administration will recalibrate inter-Korean strategy, particularly regarding symbolic overtures? This is a big question. Symbolic overtures, economic engagement, and security posturing. Of course, Lee Jae-myung's from a party that traditionally has been more in favor of engagement with North Korea. Question goes on: do you see his progressive base, progressive in this case, I think, meaning more conciliatory toward North Korea, pushing for renewed Sunshine 2.0 policy, or has the geopolitical climate and the domestic polarization made unification rhetoric more performative than actionable? So that's a really great, thoughtful question. Thanks for whoever asked it. Who would like to take that question?
I guess let me give it a try. I'm, I don't really know I don't specialize in any ways in things related to inter-Korean strategy. But I'd imagine the overall kind of like the maneuvering space for assuming that Lee Jae-myung is going to win the elections and form the new administration. I'd imagine whatever he can actually do, at least at the early stages of his administration, is probably going to be pretty constrained overall. Because, at the end of the day, we're talking about inter-Korea relationship. There's two different parties, and whatever the North Koreans are thinking are going to be also very important in making any kind of headway in this relationship. And from sort of how things are currently and where things have been heading with the North Korean regime currently, I don't necessarily think that it is going to be in much of their best interest to suddenly try to make big changes to work closely with South Korea. Although there can be a lot more discussions, symbolic gestures, narratives from both South and North Korea to talk about broader style collaboration or cooperation. I can't easily imagine any broad changes, even something as large as something like a renewed Sunshine 2.0 policy. And that is going to really heavily also depend on the very complicated sort of web of relationship between not just South and North Korea, but with Japan, with the United States, with the current Trump administration. So only after trying to think about the overall sort of constellation of like these like different actors involved, I think it'll be reasonable for us to see any like tangible progress in the inter-Korean strategy. So all that is to say, yeah, probably there's going to be some symbolic things that we can do, symbolic things that we can talk about. Are we going to see any like big changes at the early days? Not necessarily is my guess, but we'll see. Let me stop with that and try to hear from other colleagues that we have here.
I can jump in here, and I agree that I don't think we are likely to see big, momentous shifts in either whoever gets elected, either candidate's rhetoric or policy. Primarily because, again, the focus will, I think, be on economic recovery. The entire South Korean electorate is waiting for it. This is, we keep hearing of how South Korean representatives, because of the lack of a functioning or, a proper government, that we're falling behind, right? Like Japan has sent its tariff negotiator 4 times already to meet with Scott Bessent in the US. And so, those kinds of comparisons, I think, are already being made and being felt. And I think that whoever is president will have to focus necessarily on the tariffs and other kinds of economic oriented issues. On inter-Korean relations, not only is the reunification rhetoric no longer as popular as it used to be, right? If you look at opinion polls, fewer and fewer younger South Koreans believe that it is absolutely necessary to reunify, right? We've seen that trend over the decades now. So that's one. Also, there's a less, I think, rosy tinted glasses toward China's role in helping with unification. I think among more progressive and liberal South Koreans, there was a sense that China was going to be, China wanted peace on the Korean Peninsula, perhaps even more so than the US, or at least, if we're to believe opinion polls and interviews. I think that sentiment has disappeared largely because of China's economic retaliation, right, on Korea for the TMD and things like that. And so I think there's less of a belief that China, or there's less of a sense of pro-China sentiments among the progressive or younger generations. So I think the nature of South Korean debates and perceptions on the role of the US and China and other external actors on Korean reunification. All of that has shifted. And so I think it might be in some ways less pressure for Lee Jae-myung in particular, if he becomes elected president, to deliver on some of those pro or like the sunshine policy type of engagement policy that, let's say, Roh Moo-hyun or Moon Jae-in were faced with, right? This feeling that they have to cater to their progressive base. I think that might be less of a factor this time around. And so I would not expect dramatic changes either. And partly because North Korea's bargaining position has changed, I believe, right? Their recent involvement in the Ukrainian war, and there's been reports that they're getting all kinds of goodies from Russia in terms of their weapons, all the things that they've been wanting to develop. I don't know how much of that is actually true, but it does seem like they're getting a lot of kind of technology, weapons technology that they would not have otherwise had access to.
Thank you very much, Soyeon. And one thing with North Korea briefly that just sticks in my mind, in addition to what both Inbok and Soyeon have said just now, I'm thinking back to the Moon Jae-in presidency, which was well before Russia even invaded Ukraine and before Yoon Suk-yeol and before the Biden presidency had even fully kicked in, actually. North Korea at one point, out of frustration, I think, that the earlier round of diplomacy with both Moon and Trump in 2018, 2019 had gone nowhere. North Korea actually blew up one of the buildings that South Korea had put up along the border. I think it was put up just on the North Korean side of the border, close to the city of Kaesong. It was meant to be a space for the two Koreas to have discussions and collaborate and some interaction. And North Korea blew the building up. And that was in the presidency of a much more friendly president toward North Korea. That was with the Democratic Party's Moon Jae-in in power. So even symbolically, that sent that to me, it was almost like Moon Jae-in getting burned to an extent, to the extent that he had tried to extend olive branches to North Korea during his presidency and make something happen. So that further did not set the tone for this decade to be one of progress, unfortunately, in inter-Korean relations. I'd like to turn to a couple of questions on domestic politics that you've asked. One is really good from the audience question here. Despite South Korea's robust civil society, where women were central to the Candlelight Movement, that's of course back in 2016, 2017 with Park Geun-hye, and recent pro-democracy mobilizations, why do we continue to see such limited female representation at the highest levels of electoral politics, particularly in presidential or party leadership roles? In a snap election still shaped by deep regional divides, does this reveal a disconnect between grassroots democratic energy and formal political structures? What does this suggest also about the permeability of Korea's political institutions to civil society actors, especially women who have historically been key agents of democratic renewal? Jonghyun, would you like to take a shot at that one?
Yeah, I'll give it a try. I think this is such an interesting question. It's made me think the whole protest movements, and especially the movement where younger women played a central role. Put that movement into a different angle. And I believe so. I think that in general, the civil society in South Korea seems very vibrant from an outside perspective, right? And I believe it is really indeed energetic, but if we look closely inside, I would say the civil society in South Korea is still relatively weak. And even though there is an energy and there is intense civil movements at times of democratic crisis, the overall organizational strength is pretty weak. So that really constrains, or this, as this anonymous attendee suggested, that could form this disconnect between this vibrant civil society and political institutions. And in addition to that, on this underrepresentation, the persistence of underrepresentation of women despite their active role in the civil society, I would say one reason, I mean, there could be multiple reasons, but one reason that I can think of is, and that also goes back to the lack of the connection between civil society and the institutional formal politics is because the party system in Korea is also relatively less institutionalized compared to other advanced democracies. We often witness, as previous panelists have pointed out, very intense internal party conflict, and we see lots of leadership turnovers. And also, in addition to that, we see lots of turmoils and lots of changes in parties, and also some evolutions of different parties within the same party, like satellite parties, and also turnover to like a new party with the same from the same party family, but just with a different label. So that all suggests that the party system in Korea is not very institutionalized, and the organizational strength in formal politics and the ability to connect with the civil society is very constrained. So that could be one reason why we see, despite this exciting moments that we have experienced and witnessed during the candlelight protests and our recent protests, we do not see that much of institutionalization of civil movements, especially from women's movement into formal politics. Yeah, I'll think of other reasons as I hear from other panelists.
Thanks so much, Jung-Yeon. Before I go to other panelists, I also want to weave in here another question about democratization, very big picture question that I think can be connected to this theme. And by the way, I also just want to give the audience a heads up that 10:50 Eastern time, 11:50 our time, I'll be leaving the panel to go off to a television interview. So if I disappear from the grid at some point, that's why. Nothing bad is happening. It just means that I had to run out. InBook will be moderating from there. So I just want to make everybody aware of that. Here's another question, also from an anonymous audience member, that I think is very connected to what Jung-Yeon was just saying. Despite over 4 decades of formal democratization, South Korea's presidential and party politics remain deeply entangled in patterns of corruption, clientelism, and dark money, often revealed only after regime transitions. How do the panelists account for this institutional inertia? Is this a failure of enforcement and transparency mechanisms, or does it reflect a deeper democratic deficit where elite capture persists despite the vibrancy of civil society? And what role, if any, can bottom-up accountability movements realistically play in transforming this entrenched political culture? So, of course, thinking through a question like this underscores how far democracy in South Korea, for that matter, democracy in many democratic countries, still has to go to be fully robust and transparent and even legitimate. Who would like to take that one on?
Well, I would say a little bit of both, because yeah, I mean it's an evidence of democratic inertia, and I also think if you look closely into the within internal party politics, I think so. For example, I think the best example of this is the People Power Party's primary election and the candidate nomination process that happened in this election cycle. So I don't know if you know about this, but Kim Moon-soo was originally legitimately won the party's primary election, but there was an attempt from the party leaders to replace Kim Moon-soo with another outside member, who is Han Duck-soo, who had been an acting president or also the former prime minister, because the party believed that establishing Han Duck-soo as the presidential nominee for their party would help them attract, Yoon's existing political supporters. So I think that also exemplifies the lack of democratic norms and practices within the party. And that could, I think, speak to this, the lack or failure of enforcement mechanisms within the party. and also yeah, the culture of corruption and scandals. Yeah, it is still prevalent in political climate in Korea, which is very unfortunate. And there are still ongoing scandal and allegations against presidential candidates. Also, it applies to the former President Yoon. So I think it's a problem, yeah, that combines a little bit of both that the attendee suggested.
Let me try to follow up on that just a little bit. I do agree that there's a lot of problems, persistent problems that we've been seeing in Korean politics over the past decades. There are, of course, like these incidences of corruption, clientelism, dark money, all sorts of problems that we have. Um, at the same time, I don't necessarily think that these are something that we can easily think of as sort of like some kind of an entrenched political culture that is unique to Korea, or sort of like more strongly manifesting in Korea, and something that is also sort of have a strong characteristic of the Korean democracy itself. I remember. One of the things that I study is I study African politics. I remember talking to my colleagues who do study African politics of the different parts of the continent. A frustration that many of these scholars have in the continent about how oftentimes people from the outside would come in and say like, "Oh, look at all these problems. But if only if you had strong liberal democratic institutions, if only you had strong liberal democratic values." And if we look at a lot of the developments that we're seeing in, say, the United States currently, or Western Europe, in many different parts of Western Europe, um, the problems that we're seeing is not necessarily because they don't have strong liberal democratic institutions or culture. So it's a little bit more than that, I think. And I think partially that's also probably what the anonymous attendee had in that mind as well. Like we do have the institutions, we do have the rules, we do have the checks and balances, but still we have these problems. So what do we do? And sort of framing it as something of a culture or lack of our institution probably is not enough. Um, but then thinking about this sort of dichotomy between the elites and the civil society, I'm also a little bit cautious about this because civil society is also not necessarily neutral. So the people who are talking about election fraud just outside of the vote counting place, those are also people from civil society, people who are claiming that their allegations about election fraud and making these YouTube videos. These are all also doing these as part of free speech, exercise of free speech, and as part of civil society. So all that is to say, do I have an answer to this? Really, I don't. But I think things are much more complicated than sort of thinking about sort of the sort of deficit in democratic democracy that we have. How best to solve this? I'm not necessarily sure, but just wanted to also sort of share some of my thoughts, share the how complicated I think this overall situation is, if that helps a little.
I agree that it's not, we shouldn't attribute it necessarily to entrenched political culture, like Inmo was just talking about. To me, I think what the history of South Korean democratization has been all this time, right, since 1987, is in some ways reversing the decades of military rule or under authoritarian governments. And by that, I mean, I know that sounds vague, but I think under military rule, a lot of power was entrenched in the hands of the top few. And so part of the democratization process and consolidation after that has been, if you think about it, every president coming in declared war on something, right? Whether it was the media or the chaebol or the military, in fact, the prosecutor's office, right, recently. And so there seems to be this desire, not only by our political leaders or by South Korean political leaders, but also by South Korean citizens of trying to get them to share or lose some of that power, right? Take some of that entrenched power away from these traditional elite institutions. And so, and that's not, we do see that around the world with populist parties and leaders, but I think this is a little bit different, that this is really South Korea grappling with its military or history of military rule. And so that's not necessarily culture, right? I think what we're pointing out is that there are unique aspects, and every country that's undergone democratization has their own legacy that they have to deal with. And I think in South Korea, and perhaps the better comparison is with Latin American democracies as well, where we still see this constant battle against not only the military as an institution, but some of their associated, right, various power organs. And so I think what we're seeing today, what's often described as polarization or the elite civil society divide, is that tug, right, tug of war between wanting stable democratic institutions and strong leadership at the top, and yet making sure that there's some separation of power and enough checks and balances. And part of that, the reason why we keep seeing polarization, I also think, is that combination of single term presidencies, right, 5-year single terms without the possibility of renewal makes their time horizons really short, right? They can't really rely on a second term to enact or enforce their policies. And so we see this vicious cycle of presidential candidates coming in, promising this big wave of change, and then ultimately unable to deliver. Like Hans, you were saying about Moon Jae-in and some of his inability, despite coming in with a mandate, inability to carry some of those policies or policy promises out, right? And that's been true of every president in South Korea, I think.
Thank you, Soyeon. And also just a footnote on some of the comments from the panelists about this emerging kind of far-right movement that actually rallied to former President Yoon's defense. The longer that his impeachment case seemed to go on, people, of course, with MAGA hats and American flags, kind of channeling the Trump playbook a little bit in Korean politics. This was, I mean, we've had American flags at protests out in Seoul for as long as I've been in the country, really, going back 20 years. But seeing the American angle being sort of tilted toward the Trump direction was something new this time around. So I'm really going to be curious and even concerned to see, how the losing side in the election takes Lee Jae-myung's victory, and whether they'll continue to try to litigate the election somehow after the fact. If for audience members that are maybe not familiar with this, the online publication The Intercept actually did a very good piece on how the far right has been in the background in this election, kind of on the side, not in track toward gaining power here. In some respects, what we were saying earlier, that an anti-Trump bump has been helping candidates win in several countries around the world, Australia and Canada among them. But in Korea, it may play out a little bit differently. The more liberal candidate may be winning, but it might not be so much a Trump factor that has brought him to win. In fact, as I think some of the panelists have said, is the public is actually looking for Lee Jae-myung to figure out how he can both collaborate to a degree with Trump while also advocating for South Korea's interests as well. There is one more question here that I think we might take quickly on domestic politics, and then I know there's a good foreign policy question on Trump, and maybe you guys will take at the end of the panel after I go. Question from Eunbin Chung. I think picking up on what Jonghyun and others were saying earlier, can you speak more about the gender divide, especially gender by generation, that we're seeing in Korean voters and the implications of this election for such dynamics? What can we expect in terms of women's and minority rights? And before we go to the panelists, I would just add briefly that the third party candidate here, Lee Jun-seok, who is running as part of the New Reform Party, who's somewhat of a polarizing figure in Korean politics, exit polling suggests that he did very well tonight with men in their 20s, that men in their 20s abandoned, maybe more so than their elders, the People Power Party, the conservative young men, and went for Lee Jun-seok in considerable numbers, almost splitting the conservative vote evenly between PPP's Kim Moon-soo and Lee Jun-seok. And even, I think one exit poll is even showing about 10% of younger women voters were going for Lee Jun-seok, although overwhelmingly women voters were going for Lee Jae-myung, I think even more so than they did in 2022. So that generational divide we've been seeing in Korea in younger voters that first reared its head in 2022, we are seeing it maybe intensifying now in 2025. Anyway, over to the panel. And thank you all for working with me on this tonight and for collaborating. It's been nice to be with you all.
Okay, anyone want to go first? If not, then to give you a little bit of time to think, let me try to just give it a stab. And on the question of the sort of gender slash sort of generation divide, especially related to Lee Jun-suk, I have a little bit of mixed feelings about this. On the one hand, I think it is very important so let me try to rephrase that. I think it's partially at least true that we are seeing a little bit more of a conservative bent among the younger generational cohort of men in South Korea. And this is also, interestingly, not just something that is limited to the South Korean case, but also something what we're seeing in many of the other sort of advanced democracies, if you will, in parts of Europe and in North America and other places. So understanding this, I think, is very important, and trying to understand better the cause of this. At the same time, I feel a little bit um, uneasy when we talk about sort of the Lee Dae-nam situation or the issue or the young men in their 20s, as we're talking about this, them being more conservative, because there's a lot of diversity within that generational group slash gender group. If we look at, for example, the voter, I was just looking at the data that just came out from the exit poll. That I think this was what Hans was talking about. And what we see there is, of course, there's like a relatively speaking high level of support among the young men for this conservative candidate, Lee Jun-suk. It's also true that they did not necessarily give more support to this particular candidate compared to the overall distribution of others. So it just if we're sort of grouping them all together and thinking that, hey, like which group in particular is giving more support to this candidate, that's a very different thing from saying that what does this generational slash gender group like who do they support the most? Like these two are slightly different questions. And if we look at the latter, it's a little bit different. And also I was just looking at a public opinion poll that was conducted right before the elections, the last minute that was allowed by the election management body. And there, what we see is if we are just looking at what kind of candidates the young men in their 20s support, we get number one, Lee Jae-myung, number two, Lee Jun-suk, and number three, no, not number three, like the vast majority are like, I don't want to vote. I just don't care. I don't know, right? So what we're actually seeing is probably those people in that age group slash gender group who are motivated enough to come out and vote probably are going to be the more engaged and have maybe particularly like leanings in this direction. But that does not necessarily mean that all like just like the vast majority of the men in that age group is going to sort of react in a certain manner. And again, I feel like I'm sort of beating the dead horse a little bit now, but no, just by talking about this over and over and over, I think we sort of make some kind of a little bit of a distortion in how we're thinking about this, and that also leads for the politicians to work in a very weird ways. So just wanted to highlight that. But let me stop there and try to see if any of you have further thoughts on this.
I mean, I share your concerns with too much focus on this gender generational divides. And I think that unnecessarily kind of deepens the divide within the younger generation. So although I do find the gender divides in those 20s quite striking, because I do see that younger women in their 20s and younger men in 20s, they, at least from the exit poll, they have very very different political preferences. Although I do find it striking, I think we should refrain from making like too much to making an interpretation that is a bit of stretch. because that might give, as Inbok suggested at the final comment, it might give a wrong idea to politicians, and I'm very concerned about that. I think it's not necessary, so as Inbok suggested, the gender divides within younger generation may not be as severe as one might, be too concerned. And it might be politicians who are kind of, promoting it and who are politicizing it and making a, making it a bigger phenomenon than it actually is. So I think it's an important question to really examine further. And as Inbok suggested and mentioned, it's a global trend that we see in other countries as well. But there is a variation. There is some, lots of subgroup divisions within political, group of younger men and younger women. And if we try to combine it as a homogeneous, as a monolith, we are missing out very important dynamics within that big group. So I think we should really refrain from making too much interpretation out of it.
Yeah, like both of you, I think it's really important that whoever, again, it looks increasingly like with 44% of votes counted now, I'm seeing in the live update, that it will be Lee Jae-myung as president. But I think it's actually a good thing that that the issue of, I'm the candidate for gender equality versus I'm not, like that wasn't the lightning rod for this round like it was almost in 2022. What I'd be more interested to see is what they do once in office, because sometimes the rhetoric just ends up becoming symbolic that, oh, we'll get rid of the Ministry of Family and Gender Equality, or we'll create it again and we'll call it a different thing, right? Those things are just symbolic and in some ways meaningless, right? And so, but you end up dividing the electorate even more so and solidifying these divisions, as both Inbok and Jonghyun said. But rather, what I think there's broadly, if I may be so bold, there's consensus that this is an important issue, that women shouldn't be bullied online, right? But it's the framing, the political framing, that turns it into this polarizing issue, and unnecessarily so, I agree. And so really my hope for the next president is that, that they make something out of this, the fact that this wasn't such a big issue on the campaign trail, and that this is actually room for, this gives them cover, right, to actually make meaningful change because it wasn't a campaign promise or anything like that.
Okay, thanks a lot. And we only have about 2 minutes left. So I don't think we have too much time to entertain further questions. But with that, let me sort of ask a final question to the panelists. What would you then like sort of linking back to what Soyeon was just saying, what would you want to see the most from the new president? So you just mentioned that it's much more going to be about the actions once the person comes into the office. What do you think should be the priorities? What do you think are going to be the main challenges? Just in a sort of very short answer, and we can maybe go around and talk about this just as a last sort of discussion and try to wrap things up. So yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, so again, just to keep things brief, and so necessarily somewhat ambiguous, but I think a nuanced foreign policy and a very much a domestic policy that's focused on, right, unity and the things that voters actually care about, right, which is cost of living and unemployment, right? That is something that Lee Jae-myung has promised he would focus on once he gets elected. And my hope is that, he stays true on that path, right? Rather than trying to rile up unnecessary polarizing debates, but that he's focused on, again, maintaining stability in both domestic and foreign policy.
Yeah, I mean, in addition to those practical issues, I would really like to see a new phase in terms of, political culture or political climate. And I hope Lee Jae-myung, or whoever the winner becomes, really puts serious efforts into that. Really, because for example, Lee Jae-myung promised that he would not initiate any sort of political retaliation, which has been like a running theme in many recent Korean presidencies. I really hope to see, as Professor Park Seo-hyun mentioned, the new efforts that are being that on the culture in seeding the culture of unity, or at least some sort of initiatives to collaborate across the aisle, so that we can we can see some difference in the new leaders' attempts to kind of maintain the democratic resilience and the citizens' desire to restore the democratic norms and the legitimacy.
All right, well, thanks a lot. I also do have some of my own thoughts, but we're about a minute past midnight here in South Korea, and I think this is sort of like a good place to wrap things up. I'd like to thank the panelists again, and Hans, who had to leave, but for being a wonderful moderator slash chair, all the participants, and all the questions that you raised, and also especially the support from ISA, Hannah, Kat, and Joel, who made it possible for us to run this very smoothly. Hopefully, I hope this was informative for the people who participated. If we had more time, which I would love to have had more, it would have been great for us to talk more about the different questions, different issues. Maybe some of the people who have positions at the ISA currently, if you hear this, maybe we should arrange another sessions in the future so that we can talk more about South Korean politics and share our thoughts with the participants as well. Okay, so that's all the time we have. Thanks again for your participation, and hope you have a good night, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.